should we get started?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome as people join us. I'm Ann Clark. Welcome to the Friends of the Schindler House. Schindler Talks, the first one of 2024. I am a volunteer with Friends of the Schindler House, and I work with Leslie Thomas, who's on our board with the development committee. And a few years ago, on the 100th, before the 100th anniversary of the Schindler House that was built in 1922, we decided that we needed to get out there and have conversations inspired by Schindler. So we initiated this idea of the Schindler Talk, which is really an informal conversation inspired by Schindler and anything related or somewhat related. In the last couple of years, we've been able to raise a good amount of money, and fortunately, some of that money went to the restructuring and the refacing of the roof, which was fortuitous in the sense that right after we were finished, the rains in LA started, so we were able to really prevent more damage to the house. In addition to that, we've put aside some of the money for consultants for a comprehensive master plan for the restoration of the house, which we're super excited about, and there'll be more information about that forthcoming. Tonight, we are going to have a conversation, and Chuy and Todd will be in that conversation. I'm going to introduce them to you now. Todd Cronan, professor of art history, teaches modern art and architecture at Emory University in Atlanta. He's the author of Against Effective Formalism, Matisse, Bergson, Modernism, published by University of Minnesota Press, Red Aesthetics, Rodchenko, Brecht, Eisenstein, Rowan, and Littlefield. And then the book that we're going to be discussing tonight is his new book, Nothing Permanent, Modern Architecture in California, published by University of Minnesota Press. He's also the editor of Minor White's Memorable Fancies, published by Princeton University. And he also writes for popular magazines like Nation, Jacobin, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Brooklyn Rail, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He's founder and editor-in-chief of nonsite.org and sits on the board of the Friends of the Schindler House. Todd is a native Los Angelino and grew up in San Fernando Valley. Jesús, otherwise known as Chuy Barba Bonilla, was born in Mexico and grew up in Zacatecas, a Spanish colonial mining city declared as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, which is where he became passionate about history and architecture. Chuy obtained his bachelor's in architecture in 2012 from the Universidad de Valle de Mexico in Guadalajara, Mexico, and moved to California in 2012 in the same year, where he obtained his master's degree from in heritage conservation at the University of Southern California, while working as an architectural designer and preservation specialist for the firm of Page and Turnbull. He also serves as director on the Docomomo U.S. board. So they're going to be in conversation, and just a little housekeeping. We want this to be interactive, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A, and I'll be kind of monitoring those and interjecting if it makes sense. Otherwise, we'll go for a while, and we'll leave the last 10, 15, 20 minutes actually for questions and answers. So without further ado, Chuy and Todd, take it over.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anne. Well, thank you everyone for being here today with us, and I am very excited to hear about Todd's new book, Nothing Permanent, Modern Architecture in California. So one of the questions that I have is like, what inspired you to write about architecture in California specifically? I know you have a background in California and also Chicago.
Yeah. So I came to it, I guess, obliquely. I took a course with David Van Zandt in Chicago at Northwestern University, and it was a seminar on Frank Lloyd Wright. And that was my first introduction to modern architecture. So I was already in grad school at that point. I'd have kind of certain commitments in modernism and mainly French painting, but architecture was completely new to me. And during that course, that seminar in Franklin Wright, we visited, some major Wright structures in Wisconsin, S.C. Johnson and Wax, and also a school in Winnetka. And the school in Winnetka was designed, the furniture was designed by Charles Eames, rather, in 1940, so very early. And this was a kind of total new world for me. And then after I took that course in Chicago, I came back to Los Angeles and realized that there's this entire universe there that I was completely unaware of. So I got a hold of the Gebhard and Winter, like so many people before, and the Gebhard and Winter guidebook, which is an exhaustive kind of list. It's basically just a listing of the houses, and you get in your car and you drive around LA and you have this completely different understanding of the place. So there's Franklin Wright, but there's also an unbelievable array of architecture. So Chicago and LA are kind of, the two, I would say, the golden age of modern architecture is in those two places in particular in the United States. So I felt like it was this embarrassment of riches in Los Angeles, which again was totally new to me. And that was really attractive. So that was the third thing I would say is that, yeah, I grew up in LA, and the architects were also Neutra and Schindler and Davidson, Austrian, so a German background rather. So that the Austrian German background is the same as my family. So my family came over on the SS Columbus in 1938, fleeing the Nazis, from France to the United States, and came to Los Angeles. So they were part of this immigrant community. So a lot of these things kind of synced up for me, right? Living in Los Angeles and then later learning about it and realizing that it was kind of met up with certain aspects of my own background, which made it, again, even more attractive to this kind of emigre architectural world. And then the final thing was reading Richard Neutra's Survival Through Design, which is something I had on the shelf maybe for a few years. And then I kind of really read it intensely one day. And I remember just being absolutely blown away. There's nothing like that book. It is very strange and incredibly ambitious. And that was a kind of real eye-opening for me. And I probably read that in like 2009 or so. And from there is where I really got very seriously interested in it.
Okay, so where are a lot of modern architecture pieces in this book listing that you road trip in LA?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, so the Gebhard and Winter, I mean, it went through various editions. I was about to grab it. And I will grab it. So there's the old one, and this is called the Blue Brick, right? And it is really just a list. It's like a phone book, but it's a phone book of architecture, and most of it is, I would say, probably half of what appears there is gone now. And then you have a kind of newer edition like this one, which is more up to date, but then too, it's kind of disappearing. I photographed everything I could find in 1998 and 1999. Every single thing I could find that was modern. I went through LA and to try and find it. And it was totally like exploring this lost world. And you could see it was kind of in decay. There wasn't a lot of interest, especially some of the architecture was completely there was very little restoration effort on this stuff. It's nothing like today, and that's only 25 years ago. And certainly Schindler was huge, Neutra was huge, but also I'll just add, several people on those early trips just invited me inside, and that was huge. So I remember going into Harwell Harris's Hawk House and just being stunned by it. Someone invited me into an Elwood house. So
really cool.
that was a kind of very inspiring moments. Again, it was the foreignness of it, the sense of this is not normal. that there's nothing like this. You're stepping into another world was what attracted me to it.
Got it. It's pretty interesting. And so from there you started wanting to write, and you wrote your first book, or I'm not sure if it's your first, and then this new one. Is there any connections between the two?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, for me at least. So the first book is on Matisse, and it's called Against Affective Formalism. That's maybe a slightly scary title. But affective formalism is definitely a through line between the first Minnesota book and this one. That's to say the architecture book and the Matisse book. And what is affective formalism? It means that the shapes and colors, let's say in a painting, affect the person looking in some kind of fundamental way, like in their nervous system. And that idea has a deeper set of resonance among architects because you live inside them, the buildings. So the idea that the shape of the structure affects the person inside of it, fundamentally shaping them, is definitely a through line. And you know, so the story is, for me, is really, just to step out of this for 1 second, you go back to the French Revolution, and there's a sense of a loss of bearings for artists. And I'm talking about revolutionary architects, but also painters, sculptors. There's a loss of an audience of who it is. It's not the king, it's not the state, you know, it's not religious authority. You have individual patrons that are going off to a dealer soon by the mid-19th century, and it goes out into the world, and you don't know who your audience is. And that's the rise of artistic theory. And a lot of it is the search for something like a system or set of laws or kind of science for how form works, so how a medium works, that you can somehow make people feel things regardless of who that audience is. And that's a deep fantasy going back, as I say, really to the 1820s, but it's a fundamental fantasy in architecture. So part of my book is very much about the history of this, of the depth of the commitment of the idea of what the Germans called, it's a scary term, Menschenbildnerei. Now, what is that? Human sculpting. It's a terrifying word. I want to say it's especially terrifying for a German to say that in like 1920. That their shape of the structure is going to sculpt and mold the inhabitant, make you into someone. And that it runs incredibly deep in a certain tendency within architectural thinking. And that is a kind of, you know, again, a shaping of the audience. And architecture is privileged because you're in it, as Richard Neutra says, constantly, 365, 24/7, right? You're always, so it's kind of raining down on you at all times, shaping you. At least that's the fantasy.
And that sort of architectural theory that came through to LA through Neutra, correct? And that's one of the main points you do in this book.
Yeah, so there's many ways to tell it, but so Walter Gropius, the Bauhaus, arrives into Los Angeles in May of 1928. And there are actually many, Galka Shire, there's many aspects of the Bauhaus in Los Angeles in the 20s. And when Gropius is staying with Neutra, and then Neutra gets invited by Mies van der Rohe to go teach at the Bauhaus, which he does in 1930. And then he comes back and he's very explicit that what he wants to do is open the Bauhaus in the United States. And I think he takes that very seriously. And what does that mean? That means a belief in the capacity of your materials to create a certain kind of subject, person, create the person through the materials. And the way to think about this is that this is born out of a certain kind of dissatisfaction about humans changing the world for themselves. So the architect thinks of themselves as the one that's going to fix the failures of people to organize their lives for the better. So the architect's going to be the one that's going to not they're not the ones creating it themselves, at least how they tell themselves, because it's the materials that do it of their own accord. So they're arranging what they called over and over the energies in the materials. The energies are, are affecting people in these houses. I mean, they're talking about every single machine surface, every material, every surface casts off some kind of radiation onto the viewer, onto the inhabitant, and shapes them over time. And that is that view runs unbelievably deep in the Bauhaus, in certain moments before the Bauhaus, and Neutra is the most, I want to say, extreme but also purified expression of the Bauhaus commitments to this shaping capacity of architecture.
Okay. And so what is then the difference between the Bauhaus school and the school of Adolf Loos?
So yeah, I mean, so they both study informally with Adolf Loos in Vienna. So Adolf Loos is a very, very influential teacher, but again, a kind of informal teacher for Schindler and for Neutra, but they take very different things from him. The thing that's important about Loos versus Gropius, just to kind of simplify the story, Adolf Loos, architect in Austria, never imagined that the materials had inherent qualities. And what he meant by that is, and he's very explicit about this, the meaning of a structure is historical. It's contextual. It's situated. It totally depends on the era, where you are, who you are. And that is where the meaning is formed in the context. So it changes according to context. There are certain kinds of, common types, he would say, but those types are not fixed. And so the historical nature of architecture is what Schindler picks up. Now, what Neutra picks up from Loos is the sense in which Neutra tells the story over and over and over again about Loos getting a letter from someone that lived in his house 20 years after he built it, saying that the structure's kind of grown with me. And that for Neutra is a cue to think about architecture in terms of time. So Neutra thinks that it's this living in and over time is what shapes people. So he thinks that Loos is really the one that gives license to this kind of temporal shaping character. So basically, the point being is there's two different stories that are told about Loos. One which becomes compatible, I would say, with the Bauhaus in Neutra's hands, and one which is not, which is the one that's Schindler.
Okay. And then this sort of like divergent theory comes all the way down here to Los Angeles, directly influencing Schindler and Neutra. And is this influence also seen through all the other modern architects in the area?
Yeah, I mean, so both Neutra and Schindler were very gifted teachers themselves, in very different ways. So Neutra famously was a teacher for Harwell Harris and Gregory Ain, and both of them rejected Neutra quite rigorously. They kind of defined themselves against Neutra in many ways, but I think they saw exactly what he was on about. Whereas someone like Pierre Koenig was close with Neutra, and actually Neutra asked him to join his office. Pierre Koenig, case study architect. So they definitely had a way of influencing the later generation, either directly or through they were giants. I mean, they were the face of modern architecture, not just in the West Coast, but even on the East Coast, they were seen to be kind of crucial figures. So yeah, they had a very, very large impact.
And do you think this dichotomy is still present to today?
I think the tragedy of architectural thinking is a kind of fetishism of technology, a kind of determinism, and the belief in what is called now the agency of materials, that somehow either your iPhone or your screens, or a kind of create a culture. So they put, the word culture after technology. Back in the day, the Bauhaus, they called it glass culture or camera culture, and now they'll call it screen culture. And that is a deep confusion because it's giving agency to an inanimate object. So the idea being that somehow everything that's done on a screen is shaped and modified according to screen demands, which is true in a very, very low grade sense. But if I'm sitting down on, on a word processor and writing something, and writing what I write, and, whatever some fascist writes, whatever they write on a screen, we don't mean the same thing. And to say that they're both the common denominators of screen is just stupid. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's a medium. So there's a kind of over fixation on the medium's power to shape consciousness. Going back to Marshall McLuhan, the most famous bullshit version of this, right? The medium is the message. Whereas mediums are both resistant and they have give and take, right? Mediums are resist your will, they allow certain things and they resist certain things. So there's a very little sober account of how a medium functions. And it's this kind of technological determinism that I think is a mistake. And that's the sense in which it's still alive. And that's why Neutra is important, because he is the most clear-minded adherent to this view.
Okay. And being Neutra very Bauhaus attached, so what are the roots of the contemporary currency that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a historical book, but the moments that kind of contemporary currency is, you'll see certain figures like Bruno Taut. I mean, it's not a name, it's not a household name, but Bruno Taut was deeply influential for the early days of the Bauhaus. He made a glass pavilion in Cologne in 1914, and contemporary artists are obsessed with him and his colleague Paul Scheerbart, with writers like Walter Benjamin, people in this circle. That's the kind of direct connection. But as I say, Marshall McLuhan and people like that, Marshall McLuhan citing Neutra, I mean, that's actually a little known thing, citing Neutra, or someone like Buckminster Fuller, they're all really going in the same direction towards a kind of, again, it's a pervasive dissatisfaction that humans have with humans, right? That they're looking for some alternative to fix our problems. Elon Musk loves, Buckminster Fuller because it is the kind of technological fix, right? That devices will get us out of our problem, and not government, not the state, not organizations. It'll be some kind of magical fix. And that's what's alive and kicking today. And obviously, I don't think that's a good thing.
Got it. And so Schindler and Neutra take all of this approach of that architecture is how they're going to change the world. But then when they apply it onto the environment, and then they have two different approaches, correct? So one of them goes and do architecture inside, and the other one does it on the side. What does this mean? What is the difference here?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And then so maybe going back one step, I would say I mentioned the Gebhardt and Winter and that book, and the guy. It's the whole literature on modern architecture in California, not the whole of it, a lot of it is style based. And there's something, and that's not a bad thing. And yet what it does is it brings together people that have nothing to do with one another except for in a kind of formalistic, external surfaces kind of way. So they don't mean the same thing, even though they look differently. I mean, look the same rather. They look the same, but they mean differently. So maybe if the best thing someone could say about my book is that you can hopefully begin to see the differences between things that used to be stylistically brought together, called California modern, because there is a deep chasm between various aspects of it, even though in any kind of textbook or style book, they're just kind of put together. So Schindler and Neutra, obviously they do share certain qualities, no way denying that. But there are, more basic dissimilarities that are important to kind of underline. So Neutra really imagined his architecture, his relationship to nature as crucial, especially after a certain moment. So that the view, if you ever go into Neutra structure, there's going to be some kind of thermal pane wall, which is jaw-dropping. It's meant to hit you in the nervous system. A giant plane of glass. It's an entire wall of glass. And in a Neutra and the whole Neutra tradition, the Bauhaus tradition, there's no interest in expressing structure. Structure is anathema. If you're paying attention to structure, you're not paying attention to what you should be, which is the shaping capacity of the space around you. So in a Neutra, it's meant to fall away and you're supposed to see, just be kind of like drooling, looking out at the world. And you can see there's these kind of great photographs of Neutra in a sling chair, you can almost like drooling looking at these amazing views. And they're gorgeous, but they're stupefying. They're kind of lulling of consciousness. So he thought of it as a kind of, an insert into the world, which would then be transparently open on all, not on all sides, but on most sides, and at least one view just totally open. There's no edge, right? So there's no structural visibility. Schindler's also not a structural visibility, but if you've ever been in Schindler space, they're heavily sculpted. They are massively sculpted. So each room is a very different kind of organizational structure. He's constantly, creating these 90, 45-degree angles over and over again to create these very complicated spaces. But Schindler thought that the house had a fixed endpoint. So it would grow with the site. He thought that it would grow over time. It's a kind of old California craftsman attitude that the nature would kind of, grow in and around the building over time. But there was an edge to it and a limit to it. Whereas Neutra never thought it would be extensive out into the world. And that's exactly the same as Koenig. So when you see a Koenig, again with Koenig, no structural expression, total openness, as though it kind of extends into infinity.
So you would say that Neutra's approach is into out, whereas Schindler's is out in. Sort of.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely right about Neutra. There's a kind of, and he talked about it like a plant to the sun, right? You would kind of heliotropism. And you just walk in there like, oh my God, it's the best TV you've ever seen, It's the TV on the natural world. It'd be just kind of constantly changing, like a kind of ambient, music almost. And they're gorgeous. I would never want to say otherwise. My dissatisfaction with Neutra, if I can put it that way, is that he could never say, he never says in the thousands of pages he writes that what he's trying to do with his structures is create beautiful works of art. He just never would say that, but that's what they are. He wanted to make them serious, and it's larded endlessly with this kind of the most contemporary kinds of neurology, that he thought he was really, doing these cutting edge kinds of experiments on living, when really what he was an incredible artist, a beautiful artist. But it's like the last thing he ever wanted to hear about what he was doing was that he was a beautiful artist. Or Schindler, I think, would love that, Why not?
Yeah. One of your chapters really caught my attention. It's called vengeance on Neutra, Soriano, and the Eames's approaches on convergence.
Yeah.
Is it? Can you talk a little bit about it? Where does the vengeance come in?
Yeah, no, it's meant to be a striking term, right? Vengeance. It's functionalism with a vengeance, right? And it's Soriano, Raphael Soriano, also very close to Neutra, and as purely expressive of Neutra's position, as was the only architect Soriano respected, as you get. And that chapter is a kind of transition to the Eameses. And Soriano and Neutra are functionalists, and the Eameses are functionalists. It's just completely different notions of what functionalism means. Again, stylistically, you just stick them in the category of functionalism. In fact, they have very little to do with one another in terms of what function means. So the vengeance part is, well, I start with Raphael Soriano, case study architect, very influential architect in California. Didn't build much, and there's very little of it left. It's pure steel or aluminum structures. He tells a story throughout his life over and over and over again about his father beating him severely. And he brings up this story all the time, and he says it's built into his chromosomes. What do you want with him? And that is his meaning. Everything is reducible to chromosomes, right? So you can understand your response to architecture. Everything is just an expression of chromosomes. There's no intelligent agency out there. It's just chromosomes expressing themselves, which is, again, crazy idea. Neutra is using chromosome theory, but then in 54, obviously there's DNA. And Neutra gets involved in something called plasmagene. This is the functionals of the vengeance. This is kind of extreme biological vision of how architecture works. Neutra gets involved with something called plasmagene, which is about how the cytoplasm carries inheritance. Now, what does that mean architecturally? What that means architecturally is the architect can shape your genetics. That's the vengeance part. So that he believed. So Soriano thought your chromosomes are fixed. He didn't really care about shaping your chromosomes. Neutra's whole interest was that you can, through the structures, mold people's either chromosomes before 54 or after 54, their DNA. So you can shape them, shape the genetic material. So there always imagines it as a kind of an educational structure, but it's not education in the sense of like learning things. It's an automaticity or unconscious automaticity that it would shape your DNA. So you could literally change the structure of your DNA so that you and those coming after you inherit the architecture in your body. And he believed this. I mean, I guess he believed it. He certainly talks about it a lot. I guess he did believe it. And he would, and once you read it, you look at the structures quite differently. I'll put it that way. Because he really believed that when you can read a Neutra structure according to his terms, and that's not what you think. The sliding glass doors for him were about the birth canal. They would be next to a water feature, what we call a water feature, right? That's the womb. He has this whole description of a kind of traumatic encounter of birth. So what you do in opening up the window is sliding through the birth canal, and then you'd be suspended over the water, interuterine suspension, as he called it. And when you do that every day at your house, you are replaying the birth trauma. So then when you go outside into modern spaces, you're good to go, right? Because you are replaying the trauma of birth every single day when you open up the door in the morning, and then you go out into the world and you can take on any of the small scale, because he thought that the world is saturated with a kind of chaos of radiation, literal and figurative, not figurative, literal. Everything around you is raining down on you. So in his houses, you can control that. That's the difference. So that's That's the vengeance part. Hopefully the vengeance is clear
Yeah,
about how extreme that vision is.
that's very interesting. So, in your opinion, what do you think he was trying to change in the humans?
Um, you, what was he trying to change? Um,
Because he was trying to fix us, right?
yes.
Through architecture.
Yes. Um, I think he thought that all of the social problems, which he lists, over and over again, that all of the social ills of society can be fixed through these kinds of scientific means and not reform. So this is the politics of this. Every single one of them are anti-statist. They are all against collective organization. They're all against humans collectivizing for themselves to change the world for their own ends, because that's just going to, that's just a superficial layer. So you have to get down to this deep core, which is biological, and that's the only way things are going to change. So he makes a courthouse, right? This is a kind of a stunning moment. The Orange County Courthouse, it's still there. The Orange County Courthouse, and he talks about the kind of butyric acid that's being radiated from people's bodies in the courthouse that would cause, certain kinds of, the smells would cause soporific tendencies. And he literally thought this is going to change the outcomes in the court. And meaning that for him, the crimes were committed by these deterministic means because your surroundings are bad. Your physical surroundings are bad. And your whole life, you're being criminalized by a kind of chaotic world, physical world, structural world. So that you needed to repair the damage being done to you in that chaos outside by modern architecture. I mean, it's a wild idea, but unfortunately, people have certain kinds of, biological fantasies all the time now, kind of bad science. And anti-statism is the world we live in, unions are gutted. There's no healthcare. So they were successful, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so what else about politics then comes in this period of architecture in California? Because the political climate was very different back then to what it is now. And I'm guessing there's still a connection going on, correct?
Yeah, so the politics really comes up most explicitly in kind of chapter 1 and in the conclusion. And chapter 1 is the one that goes back to the Bauhaus through Neutra. And the way I describe it there is, again, a kind of, the politics is a pessimism about humans. And what you find among the Bauhaus and the Expressionist architects is the most outrageous critique of the state and welfare organizations. It's not just like they're against welfare organizations, in that sense, it's completely commonplace now. But they actually think that they're responsible for all the evils in the world. So hospitals, welfare organizations, socialization, all that stuff is damaging people. Because if you build a hospital made of bricks, you're killing them twice over. That sounds like a joke, right? I can show you a picture, and it sounds like a joke, I know. Let me show you one picture that's quite vivid on this point. So this was something quoted by many people at the time throughout the 20s. Heinrich Zille. You can kill a man with a dwelling just as surely as with an axe. And this is the politics, right? So they don't give a shit what the people are doing. They think that it's the environment that's creating people, right? Change their environment, change the people. It has nothing to do with like paying them a living wage. They have absolutely, it's not that they just don't have any interest in that. They are actively against it. So you can kill a man with a dwelling just as surely as with an axe. And then as I kind of quote here on the other side, so Zille says that around 1920. Neutra says, our environment is our fate. right before he dies, 1969. The environmental fatalism is the politics in a sense. And again, it means that what you do is really only an expression of your environment, and that you have no agency, or a better term is intentionality, to shape the world for your own ends. Now, as I said, the conclusion also has a politics. That's Rayner Banham.
Mm.
And Rayner Banham, I'll stop the share here. Rayner Banham in 1971 wrote a book on Los Angeles, perhaps the most influential book certainly one of the most influential books on Los Angeles. It's a great book. There's no reason not to read it. 72, he does a movie. Rayner Banham loves Los Angeles. And the book is basically a kind of large FU to the East Coast establishment and to the British, he's British, and to the British establishment that they all hate LA, but he actually just loves it. But it's kind of like the most patronizing, it's all surfing and hippies and, smog-filled sunsets that he loves. It's a complete fantasy. It's just the alternative of what he thinks of as the staid, uptight East Coast, rationalist circle in New York. LA is everything it is not. And it's just like, that's not a good account. So Banham called himself a Tory socialist, which is a Tory. He also called himself a libertarian, so it's a very LA kind of thing. He really does become LA. But the thing that's interesting about the book Los Angeles is, so he's really interested in Ray Bradbury. This has not really been discussed, but the last part of the book is about these Ray Bradbury stories from his Mars stories, where people come from Earth and they land on Mars and they become different beings. And he doesn't mean that like they take on new habits or they get into the new, attitude and they start seeing things differently. They literally become a different being. So Banham uses David Hockney's very famous painting, Bigger Splash, to illustrate this idea of jumping into this water and coming out a new being, like a Martian, not like a Martian, a Martian. Just the Martian is a Los Angeles Martian. So they all come from, the Eameses come from St. Louis or whatever, and they're all coming from the East, and they come to Los Angeles and they become LA Martians. So he has this kind of deterministic view that you literally become a different entity. So there's all of this biological determinism in Banham that has been glossed over. I mean, and it's a dangerous idea. And that goes along also with the kind of libertarian world, where everyone has their own kind of consumer desires, and those should be just unleashed, right?
And so this biological determinism kind of reinforces the Neutra's idea that the environment shapes you.
Totally.
I have a few comments here, if I can interject. Yeah. One from Olive, curious about Todd's understanding of anti-statism. There's the anti-statism of Elon Musk and techno-determinists. There's also the anti-statism of left communism and council communists, etc. Curious how you're using this term and how you understand this in relationship to modernist architecture, which is often funded by wealthy people and or the state.
Yeah. So they're all explicitly anti-status in this. Well, I mean, it's a rhetoric, right? It's not. It's less a reality. We kind of have to go architect by architect to get into the nitty-gritty of this. But the attitude is anti-status in the sense that it's critique of the welfare state, whether we mean that in the 1950s version or we mean it. So the common term in the kind of German Viennese circles was spiritual poverty, right? Which has nothing to do with actual poverty. Spiritual poverty is like, that's the one where the rich and the poor. So in the Bauhaus Manifesto, right, 1920, the kings and the beggars will hold hands. There is no sense whatsoever in that whole tradition that you would get rid of kings. Never. So the craftsman and the artist will come together. There's no sense of like eliminating the distinction. So they're totally committed to, and Gropius is writing about factory efficiency. It's just about changing the structure. So you have happy workers, right? Happy workers. There is never even an iota of interest in getting rid of an exploited worker. It's just how do you exploit better? So the anti-statism is about kind of individual agency. And, this gets serious with Banham. Banham starts really attacking government agencies. So there's these famous photographs of him, riding his bike in the Mojave Desert. That's his fantasy of the world. And he has this incredible jag on the Parks Department, who are, environmentally trying to, save the Mojave Desert. And he hates them, right? He hates this government regulation where it should just be free consumer desire, right? And that's his vision of the world. And he's writing on this. I should show you the picture, right? I can grab it now. So this is very much. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah, the famous picture of him riding his little bike in the Mojave by himself, right? And it very much devolves onto this individual liberty, right? And he becomes a libertarian, describes himself a libertarian. That's the anti-statist. So against regulation. They are against regulations, against the welfare state, against state intervention. Of course, they are statists in, when as libertarians, this is the kind of basic contradiction. It's like, oh, so you're fine about dismantling the military? Well, not that. Right. So they're not actual libertarians. They're not actual they're not, I don't even know what that would mean to be really anti-statist, but they're totally opposed to unionization, welfare state, socialism. So California, right? Prop 13. I come to this at the conclusion, right? California is a perfect instance of a certain kind of libertarian utopia in that they don't pay their property taxes, right? And that's, systematic. So they can, they kind of complain about straws as long as they don't have to pay their property taxes, right? Because they don't want that going to things that they can't control. It's an attack on their individual liberty. So, this is intertwined with this history. I guess what I would encourage people to look at, because I was stunned by it, is the degree of virulence and hatred of welfare organizations in the post-World War I era. So people like Bruno Taut, Paul Scheerbart, even Walter Benjamin, incredibly critical of reform, right? And I think that's a dangerous set of commitments. And as I say, the consequences are the one we're living now, right? So we have a gutted welfare state. This is to the left and the right. It's not a very useful term. Left and right is not a particularly useful term. It's not as if Neutra's not on the right. Well, it depends what we mean by it. I assume he voted Democrat, let's say. But he was also thought, less government, better. And here we are.
We are. I've got a couple more, actually a few more comments and questions. So Chloe just made a comment, which is interesting, that it makes architects, what you're talking about, Todd, makes architects basically the most powerful people imaginable.
No, that's a great point. So the saving grace of this story is, in a certain sense, they're tied up with this history, but they're also useless. So it's not as if it works. Let me be clear. Neutra was not successful in the sense that he actually made people. Total bogus, completely bogus. They're just beautiful structures. I would want to live in them. They're very attractive. Look, if we want to get even a more basic politics of this, the most expensive house by one of these architects, getting back to the private public thing, let's say an Elwood house in 1960, a mansion by today's standards in those eras, $16,000. You're talking $250,000 or $275,000 in today's money. So this is a utopia in a certain sense. I should be clear that things have gone off the rail in terms of wealth distribution since 1968. Every single year, the gap has expanded, right? So my guys, And another way of looking at it, guys and gals, Ray Eames, it's key here, is that things looked better back then. Let me put it in one other way. It's not a crazy thing in the 1950s and early 60s to be critical of aspects of the welfare state because you had one, right? But it is insane to be rehearsing that same set of positions now in which there is none, or that it is being aggressively undermined. So the part of my problem is that we uncritically accept these views from this earlier moment. I mean, it's also like saying a European socialist complaining about socialism. It's like, good for you, you've got healthcare, right? And you're saying, the state's intervening in my life. It's like, well, that would be nirvana from our perspective in terms of healthcare. At least I would suggest it would be. So we do have to think in terms of historical terms, I would say.
Another comment from Lena, isn't this true though? We think about poverty and environmental medicine, then the argument of environment and it as a determining force, it certainly makes sense thinking of Olmsted and the park movement.
All I would say, I mean, there is a sober version of this and a not sober version of this. The sober version of this is the sense in which I'm not painting my room vermilion red, because that I would say is annoying, and I think many people would agree. It's still cultural. It's not like it's determined. So there are certain kinds of consensus we have about how environments affect attitude and mood. It's very low grade. It's very low grade. And the problem is when they build on this very, very low grade truth, again, still cultural, but shared widely, and then build this entire apparatus that every shred of our environment is affecting us in this particular way, and that they can control it.
Two questions from Elsa. First, wouldn't you think of Neutra's spider legs as a fairly expressive, explicit nod to structure?
Well, so I have a few photographs of this. It's a great question. And it's kind of interesting. You have different photographers addressing structure in Neutra because you can't really repress it. But yeah, what you most often see is that he will hide the members, right? So where it hits the ground, it is obscured. So he doesn't want you to notice how it touches, how things are held together and resting on one another, versus the kind of extreme kinds of structural expressionism with the Craig Elwood or the Eameses, or I mean, not Schindler so much, but there's very expressive structure in Schindler. So Neutra didn't think of that as there's like the module, for instance, in a Neutra is not something you can reconstruct with your eye, and you're not meant to. There is a module usually, and you could like measure it out, but it's not marked. There's no, whereas for instance, like an Elwood, or Harwell Harris for that matter, they're really trying to expressively show you how the thing is put together. I don't want to rest too much on that specific quality, but Neutra himself did not want to emphasize structure. I mean, I'm not making this as a kind of controversial point. He didn't think it was a good thing to do.
Second question is more general and perhaps redundant. Could you expand more on your title, Nothing Permanent, and how you're conceiving of permanence in this context of the book? I am curious both in the framing of the buildings and sites as permanent structures, as well as the permanence, impermanence of design, intent, / artistic impression, use, etc.
Right. Yeah, great. So the title is from Harwell Harris. And it's him describing his experience of the Schindler House, that it felt to him as though a kind of impermanent structure. And what I kind of describe is, Schindler was very impressed by camping sites, tents, tent shelters. And I think there's a way in which it would not be wrong, I think, to think of Schindler houses as a kind of campsite, barely in place, barely held together. And they're cheap. Unfortunately, for preservation needs, they're not richly, neither are Neutras for that matter, richly, rich materials. So they're meant to have a kind of temporary look to them. Again, it's an aesthetic. It's meant to feel as though it's a temporary enclosure, and not a fixed permanent structure. So that's how it works. And then and the Eameses are really, really interested in this, in kind of self-dissolving structures, structures that would disappear in use. That's the thesis of the kind of longest chapter on the Eameses, that their commitment is towards things that would be totally consumed in use. That's the impermanent ideal that they're pursuing. I think it's, falling in line with what Schindler's up to. Neutra's is not impermanent. Neutra is interested in permanence in perpetuity, and that he thought about his structures, what he wanted his structures to be able to be, every inhabitant from now until the sun takes over the earth, he'd be able to control the experience in it. And what he does is, part of what I show is that he has Schulman photograph it every time of day, right? So I go through the Kaufman, it's actually a series of photographs, right? And he would show these as a series, early morning till twilight, and then at night. And that he would think of he'd be in control of the whole, what he called programming of the site. So it was a permanent control of the inhabitant over time. And there's kind of one anecdote I talk about. He comes to the Lovell House in the 60s. So there's, several tenants in here. It's built in 27 to 29. He comes back in the 60s, and they're hanging something on the wall, and he types out a set of plans for them about how to hang their watercolor, how it should sit on the wall, where it should sit on the wall, the kind of frame it should be in. And I should add that room has actually already been remodeled by Gregory Ain, but he still thinks that he can kind of like handle, the spaces. That's the permanence, right? That he could finesse the least square inch of the design towards his end. So that's the opposite of the nothing permanent.
Two more comments, and we got to wrap it up here, but I missed this one, sorry. From Gebhardt and Winder's Guide to Architecture in Southern California, our present awareness of Southern California architectural heritage has been due almost to one woman crusade upon the part of the critic and historian Esther McCoy. That's a mention. Any thoughts, Todd?
Oh, she dominates my book. Esther McCoy is the linchpin of my argument in many, many ways. So it is oops.
I don't know what's going on with my camera. Sorry.
I think Esther McCoy is the counterpoint to Banham and the rest of them. And she worked in Schindler's office, and I think that experience was fundamental for her. But she's a through line for the whole book. So she is the through line, for instance, between Schindler and the Eameses, which in a certain sense is kind of counterintuitive, but not for her. And that was hugely important for me. So I am incredibly indebted to Esther McCoy.
And just a comment, we're running out of time here, but Justice said, fantastic book. He was wondering more about Eames's relationship to the state. I think we talked a little bit about the Eameses, but I think we're kind of running out of time here. And Ian says, very thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much. Lots of comments. Just say that I believe our monetary system should be redesigned.
Yeah, so the Eameses, the one other thing about the politics we haven't talked about is that this is the 50s, is the McCarthy era, and they were all under suspicion. Gregory Ain was monitored by the FBI. His file is this big, hundreds of pages. Garrett Ekbo, the very great landscape designer, has a several hundred-page FBI record. A landscape designer, he did gardens. Garrett Ekbo was monitored from the 40s, the late 40s, through the 1970s, early 70s. I think the last record is him in 72 going to a lecture at UCLA. So the Eameses were deeply, very much in the crosshairs of the McCarthyites. There's some sense that they had communist meetings early on there, but I wouldn't want to that I don't really rest a lot of it on the kind of explicit politics of these folks, although that's totally interesting. More to the point is that the Eameses thought of a kind of where the work would dissolve, right? So there'd be nothing left over, so there'd be no surplus value, and that is I don't know what I could say about the state. The Eameses were totally part of that 50s generation, which was the Galbraith world of the affluent society. So they're endlessly, which from my perspective nowadays is like a total mistake, right? Is that the whole problems they saw in the 50s, again, in the McCarthy era, was consumption. So liberals were hammering endlessly about spectacle and consumership and consumption and worrying about, again, the spiritual lives of people, while slowly, the welfare state was eroding. So they're still talking about, the Eameses are talking about in the 60s about, consumerism in LA. And I just think that's a kind of a red herring. That's a generous way to put it. That they all kind of bought into in a sense. Again, that was when there was a welfare state, they could be concerned, I think rationally concerned, with a certain kind of consumerism. But once that welfare state has been gutted, to still go on about consumerism is crazy. That's the last thing on my list of ills in society, is what people are buying, because they're buying very little because they have no money. So, it's for a better world where we can sit around talking about what they should be buying. But back then it seemed natural to them to be worrying about, consumerism.
It's 8:30, and I thought this was an incredibly interesting, fascinating conversation, and the questions were equally provoking. Chuy, you want to kind of wrap up with anything, any comments you have?
No, this has been incredible.